Their story has been the subject of song, film, even a Sherlock Holmes book. The name Molly Maguires is well known enough, but what is assumed to be known about them is perhaps dubious. The historicity behind the events that would be identified with the organization cannot be simplified to mere labor disputes or the popular belief that the persecution of the Irish people was a critical component in the prosecution. What is important is that the period of presumed Molly Maguire activity, roughly 1860 until the final execution in 1879, represents a boiling point in American labor practices, where groups of desperate workers were willing to risk their lives and well-being in order to better their lot in life, consequently shaping the world that we've inherited. The battles in the coal regions of northeastern Pennsylvania can be seen as a precursor to the Homestead Steel Strike, which would occur towards the close of the 19th century and on the other side of the Commonwealth. This week's story begins not in Pennsylvania, but across the Atlantic in Ireland, where the Great Famine, the potato blight of the 1840s, had snuffed out more than 1 million people. The numbers of dead were surpassed only by those who gave up on the ancestral soil, most of them immigrating to port cities of the United States, notably New York, Boston, New Orleans, Philadelphia. The decade, 1840, that decade's high mortality and immigration rate would reduce Ireland's population by nearly a quarter. Many of this first wave of Irish immigrants were farmers who had abandoned the desperate conditions of home for the unknown. Those who found themselves in Pennsylvania were quick to find themselves in the coal mining operations in the anthracite region, so called for the valuable anthracite coal that can be readily found. With the large influx came a rise in anti-Catholic sentiment as well as a general distrust of the newcomers, which led to neighborhood skirmishes and segregated enclaves walled by ethnicity and religion. Resentment between the established populations in the area was increased as the mine operators were known to specifically recruit for these new arrivals, whose situation was grave enough that they would endure the mines for less than the current force was being compensated. So life in the mines was difficult. Accidents that maimed and accidents that killed occurred with some regularity. Despite the hazards involved, the pay remained low. The lack of a proper response by those controlling the mines pushed some, it's argued, to fight back with the only currency open to them. In 1862, a mine operator was beaten to death by a group of men, and this act would ultimately be attributed to the Molly Maguires. The poor conditions in the mine and the occasional high-profile catastrophe such as that which occurred at the Avondale Mine of 1869, the Avondale Mine disaster. This is around the Wilkes-Barre area. At Avondale, over 100 miners, some as young as 10, suffocated in an underground fire. And this disaster encouraged many laborers to risk unionizing. The Working Men's Benevolent Association was formed in 1870, just mere months after the Avondale disaster, and it was certainly a direct result of that disaster. Now, there's some ambiguity about the Molly Maguires. Some see them as having been an early, aggressive attempt to solidify a proper labor movement among the miners, a labor movement with teeth. However, others view them as being nothing more than an opportunistic group whose objectives were more personal vendettas or driven by anger, though with no real or focused political ambition. This, combined with the group's secrecy, as well as the sensationalist testimony designed to pin the labor problems and the violence associated with directly to the Molly, has produced a history where one can read of the executed Mollys as either thugs, terrorists, innocent men of hard circumstances, or a precursor to, as I mentioned earlier, the labor movement that we would see really take hold in the 1890s. There were stories of Mollys abducting mine administration members and administering to their hand-hot stovetop. Other accounts speak of them robbing payrolls and sabotaging trains. If there were Mollies, it's difficult to tell, as they've left no written pact of their membership or activities, and of what is assumed known about their exploits comes really from folklore, hearsay that's been passed on, and accounts from those who infiltrated and or prosecuted the group. What is certain is that the Molly Maguires existed in one form or another in Ireland, and some of the heavily populated Irish cities in Western England as well. But those groups in the old country read more like reaction to the conditions of the famine on one side and more of a roving gang of Irish on the other. In Pennsylvania, though, the Molly Maguires were closely associated with the Ancient Order of Hibernians, an Irish fraternal organization. Though there was no established direct link between the Hibernians and the Mollies, both organizations required potential members to be of Irish stock, and so that it's likely that a membership in the region's fraternal order meant that you could be scouted for membership into the Mollies. By the early 1870s, the large majority of the region's miners were unionized in the Working Men's Benevolence Association. Violence, still commonly occurring, was reported as being perpetrated by the Maguires. Now, the industrialist, kind of an oppressive figure, Franklin B. Gowen, an Irishman, the Schuylkill County District Attorney, the owner of the Reading Railroad, not the Reading Railroad, the Reading Railroad of Monopoly fame, not of book fame, PBS fame. Franklin Gowen also owned a majority of northeast Pennsylvania's coal mines. And in the 1870s, he hired out the brutish Pinkerton Agency in order to infiltrate the Molly Maguires, report on their activities, and squash both the Union and its more violent element in one sweep. One of the Pinkerton detectives, an Irish-born James McParlin, infiltrated the group. James, going by the name McKenna, claimed to have infiltrated the group and was reporting back to another Pinkerton agent who had been planted in the mine's private security firm. McParlin gained access to the Mollies by 1873, and he was reporting proposed attacks on mine employees. He also reported the plans to assassinate police officers and blow up a railroad bridge. There were others that he reported back to his superiors and wrote about. McParlin is said to have become disgusted at one point, though, when he learned that people that he had ousted as Mollies to his superiors had been raided in their homes, presumably by vigilante elements or by other Pinkerton agents. It's not really known. He wrote a letter immediately following the raid, where he feared that, in the future, members of the Mollies may not refrain from killing women, as the vigilantes who were responsible for the murders of presumed Molly members in their home had taken out a Mrs. McAllister and fatally shot her. In 1875, there was the Long Strike, a 6-month lockout that had been exacted by Gowen. This strike resulted in the demise of the Working Men's Benevolence Association. In January 1876, the trials against the accused Molly Maguires began, and Gowen himself appointed himself as the special prosecutor. Many of the court proceedings relied primarily on James McParlin's testimony, the man who infiltrated the Maguires. Occasionally, McParlin's testimony would be buttressed with some fallacious witness. Over the next 2 years, 20 men accused of various crimes under the banner of the Molly Maguires were publicly hanged before large crowds in Pottsville, Mockchunk, now known as Jim Thorpe, Sunbury, and Bloomsburg. One of the most famous stories surrounding the Mollies takes place in its final chapter, when an Alexander Campbell, a tavern owner who was charged with participating in the murders of 2 men, supposedly slapped his hand on the cell wall and proclaimed that his handprint would remain on the wall over the years as a testament to his innocence. To date, you can still see a handprint shape in cell number 17 at the old Carbon County Jail in Jim Thorpe, again formerly known as Mock Chunk. Despite some motions at the state legislature aimed at ruling Campbell's trial and that of several other executed Mollys as inherently unconstitutional, nothing yet has been made official. Some others extend the spooky vibe by pointing out that Franklin Gowen, the man who ruthlessly ran so many of the mines, who had hired the Pinkertons, prosecuted the accused Mollys, and not to mention oversaw the Reading Railroad Massacre, Franklin Gowen would ultimately commit suicide by a single gunshot to the head. Some claim that he was actually killed by a surviving Molly or a Molly sympathizer, but this is doubtful. Regardless, Gowen, it is said, haunted the Wormley Hotel where he had taken his life. The hotel was torn down at the turn of the century, and it's not known if Gowen's ghost was evicted prior to the demolition. So what were the Molly Maguires? Were they thugs, terrorists, desperate men fighting back in whatever way they could? Despite the murky waters of history, the Molly Maguire story continues to interest people not just in Pennsylvania, but the world over.